Rain clung to the morning light like a thin veil. On the tarmac at Royal Air Force Kenley, the sound of a Merlin engine warming up rolled across the concrete in slow, uneven pulses, as if the machine already sensed the danger ahead. At 7:42 on a March morning in 1941, a Hurricane stood ready for patrol, and Squadron Leader Davies climbed into the cockpit knowing the next few minutes could decide his life. A few paces away, Beatrice Schilling watched in silence. She carried no rank on her sleeve, no medals on her chest, only a small brass washer hidden inside a leather satchel, and a question that could not wait for another day. For months, British fighters had fallen from the sky in the same terrible pattern. A pilot pushed into a dive. The engine hesitated. Then it died. In the space of 1.5 seconds, a German fighter closed 300 yards and finished the job. No warning. No second chance. Yet here she stood, holding a part so simple it looked like it belonged on a workbench, not a battlefield. How could something this small alter the rhythm of life and death in the air war over Britain? We returned to that morning at Kenley, where one decision would lift or bury an entire hope. But before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to WW2 Secret Archives and leave a comment about which country you're watching the video from. The summer before that morning at Kenley had carried a different kind of tension. The Battle of Britain had formally ended, yet the airfields across southern England felt no relief. German fighters still crossed the Channel in sharp, violent bursts, probing radar lines, testing petrol responses, and forcing the Royal Air Force to maintain a tempo that strained men, machines, and every maintenance shed from Biggin Hill to Tangmere. The sky had quiet moments, but none of them felt safe. Too many pilots returned with stories of engines that faltered at the very instant when instinct demanded a dive. Too many did not return at all. The trouble had begun when the Royal Air Force made what should have been a straightforward improvement. In the summer of 1940, fighter squadrons switched to 100-octane fuel. The change gave the Merlin engine more boost and more power, transforming the Spitfire Mark II into a machine capable of reaching 370 miles per hour in level flight. On paper, it narrowed the gap with the German Messerschmitt fighters. In practice, the extra power revealed a fragile truth inside the heart of the British engine. The Skinner's Union carburetor could not handle the violent swings of negative gravity that came with real combat. Pilots described it the same way. No matter their rank or experience, the moment they pushed the stick forward to gain an angle on a diving enemy, the engine surged, then went silent. It lasted only 1.5 seconds. But 1.5 seconds was an invitation to disaster. Fuel surged to the top of the float chamber, starving the jet, cutting the flame. A British pilot dropped into a dive at high speed, only to find himself gliding helplessly while a German fighter rolled in behind him, confident that the Merlin would lose its breath. It was a small window in time, yet it swallowed lives. German pilots had no such burden. Their Daimler-Benz engines used direct fuel injection, which meant no float chamber, no flooding, no dying engine. They could push their aircraft into a dive, invert, roll out of sight, climb hard, and never lose a heartbeat of power. Speed became their shield, and gravity became their weapon. They understood the British weakness long before most British engineers did. After-action reports from the Luftwaffe mentioned how easily a Messerschmitt could bait a Spitfire or Hurricane into a negative gravity maneuver. The pattern repeated so often it became almost ritual. Inside this harsh rhythm stood the Royal Air Force and its pilots, many of them barely past 20 years old. They climbed into their fighters each morning knowing that the same maneuver that might save them could also kill them. Squadron leaders tracked losses with a quiet dread. Training schools rushed to push fresh pilots through their courses, but skill could not be taught fast enough to match the casualty lists. The Royal Air Force was not only losing aircraft, it was losing the irreplaceable judgment, intuition, and the steady calm of men who had survived enough missions to know how to stay alive. For the engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, the problem was more than a technical bug. It was a wound that would not close. The pressure carburetor, a fully redesigned fuel delivery system, was already on the drawing board. Rolls-Royce had begun early work on it, but a proper solution meant years of research, testing, and modification. 2 years, perhaps 3, before installation on active aircraft. The war would not wait. The enemy certainly would not. Every week without a fix wrote another grim page in the operations logbooks. This was the landscape into which Beatrice Schilling stepped when she arrived at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in November 1939. She entered an engine department filled entirely with men, save for one secretary. Many of them had never worked alongside a female engineer. A few did not hide their doubts about whether a woman belonged in the hangar at all. Schilling ignored them with the kind of discipline that came from years spent tuning engines alone in her parents' shed. She knew how to take apart a machine until it told the truth. She knew how metal behaved when pushed to its limits. And she knew, with a calm that unnerved some of her colleagues, that the Merlin's flaw could not be dismissed as a minor inconvenience. It was killing pilots. She read every combat report she could find. She sat with pilots who had managed to restart their engines while falling through the sky. She studied maintenance logs and listened to ground crews describe the same failure with the same tightness in their voices. The pattern solidified, harsh and undeniable. The float chamber flooded when gravity reversed. Fuel went where it should not. The jet starved. The engine died. In a laboratory, the problem was inconvenient. In a dogfight, it was a death sentence. Schilling did not search for a grand reinvention. She searched for a constraint. What if the flow of fuel could be limited just enough to keep the chamber from flooding, even when gravity reversed, not starved, not overfed, just held within a narrow threshold that the engine could survive? Simple physics, applied with precision. She machined the first prototype herself from brass, a thimble shape at first, no larger than a fingertip. Then she refined the idea into a flat washer with a precisely drilled hole at the center. She tested 17 variations before finding the one that delivered enough fuel for full throttle without allowing excess during negative gravity. Bench tests confirmed the principle. The washer prevented flooding during simulated maneuvers. But she also knew what every engineer understood in wartime. A bench was not the sky. A controlled laboratory did not contain the violence of wind, turbulence, and fear. The Merlin behaved one way on the ground and another way when pushed into a high-speed dive. If the restrictor failed in the air, a pilot could die. Regulations forbade installing unapproved parts on operational fighters. The consequences for doing so were severe. Yet morning after morning, young men stepped onto the tarmac and strapped themselves into machines that Schilling knew were betraying them. The stakes were no longer theoretical. Each delay meant another name added to the list no one wanted to read. And so, by the time she stood on the airfield at Kenley with a leather satchel filled with brass washers, the question was no longer whether the Royal Air Force needed a solution. The question was whether anyone had the courage to implement one before the next engine went silent in the middle of a dive. The morning of the test at Kenley set a tone that would echo across the next weeks, though no one on that field could have predicted it. When Squadron Leader Davies lifted his Hurricane off the runway and pointed the nose toward the channel, the ground seemed to hold its breath with him. Fuel fumes hung in the air, shimmering in the cold light, and the sound of the departing aircraft faded into the low hum of generators and distant chatter from maintenance bays. For Beatrice Schilling, those first minutes were a kind of suspended time. She was surrounded by the life of a fighter station at war, but none of it reached her. In her mind, she heard only the rise and fall of a Merlin in a dive. The exact moment fuel surged upward, the instant the flame died. She had lived inside that moment for 11 months. Up above the coastline, Davies and his section crossed into the patrol zone east of Dungeness. The sky over the grey water opened into the kind of cold clarity that pilots remembered years later, the kind that made metal vibrate differently and the horizon cut sharp enough to sting the eyes. German fighters had been active over this stretch of coast all week. Davies knew it. His men knew it. Schilling knew it. The patrol settled into formation, climbing to 15,000 feet before leveling off. Nothing seemed unusual. That, too, was part of the danger. The contact came quietly. A short acknowledgement over the radio. A shift in tone. The kind that told ground controllers everything they needed to know. Davies had spotted movement below. 2 Messerschmitt fighters, angled toward France, unaware that a trio of Hurricanes had begun to drop into their wake. The altitude advantage belonged to the British. It was the one edge they could always count on. At least, they could until their engines faltered. From the ground, Schilling raised her field binoculars. She could not see the enemy, of course, but she saw the Hurricanes turn. She knew the shape of that turn, knew it meant the dive had begun. Beside her, Sergeant Cooper watched the sky with his hands tucked into his pockets. Eyes narrowed, jaw clenched. Neither spoke. Words felt intrusive. In the cockpit, Davies pushed the control column forward. Negative gravity lifted his harness straps against his shoulders. This was the exact moment when every instinct learned in training told him to brace for the breathless silence of a dead Merlin. Yet, instead of silence, he felt the vibrations strengthen. The propeller cut through the cold air with unwavering rhythm. The engine held its power as the altimeter unwound. For the first time in nearly a year, a Hurricane in a high-speed dive behaved exactly as a pilot needed it to behave. Davies closed the distance with astonishing speed. 200 yards. The Messerschmitt pilot, startled, broke sharply to the right. Davies fired a burst, a clean arc of tracer slicing through the winter air. The enemy fighter shuddered as rounds struck the wing root, then dipped away, disappearing toward the haze over the channel. Davies did not pursue. He pulled up, climbed back to altitude, and felt the Merlin respond without hesitation. It was not simply working, it was performing. When the Hurricanes returned to Kenley, Schilling stood at the edge of the dispersal area as Davies climbed down from the cockpit. His face carried a look she had not expected. Not relief. Something closer to exhilaration. Cooper asked the question that hung between all 3 of them. Davies shook his head with a rare smile and declared it was the best the Merlin had ever run. The words carried enough weight to push aside fear, doubt, and 11 months of grim reports. From that moment, events accelerated in a way that wartime mechanics understood but could never fully explain. Word spread among pilots faster than any memo from headquarters. By nightfall, half the station had heard some version of the story. By the following morning, 3 squadron commanders in 11 Group had telephoned Kenley to confirm whether the rumor was true. And if it was, how quickly the Royal Aircraft Establishment could supply more of the miracle washer. The following days brought a kind of organized urgency that only a war zone can sustain. Schilling returned to Farnborough with Cooper's notes and Davies' testimony. She prepared documentation that skirted the boundary between recommendation and confession. The Air Ministry reviewed her proposal in less than a week. The wartime atmosphere left little room for bureaucracy. Losses were too high, and the advantage granted by direct fuel injection on German fighters was too great. Approval arrived with the kind of speed that surprised even Schilling. Rolls-Royce received the order to produce the restrictors. Hundreds per week. Then thousands. But production alone could not turn the tide. Installation had to be just as rapid. Every Merlin in operational service needed the restrictor. Every squadron needed to be trained to fit it in minutes, not hours. That task fell to Schilling and a small team of 3 engineers and 2 civilian mechanics. They loaded their kits onto a van, strapped spare restrictors into padded crates, and fanned out across southern England. Their first stop was Biggin Hill, the busiest station in 11 Group. The commanding officer, Group Captain Grace, had lost 7 pilots to engine failures in 2 months. He greeted Schilling at the gate with the kind of restrained urgency that experienced officers used when emotion had already drained away. He wanted every Spitfire and Hurricane on his field fitted immediately. Not by the end of the week. Not after lunch. Immediately. Ground crews worked in rotating teams. 4 aircraft at a time. 12 minutes per installation. Disconnect the fuel line. Insert the restrictor. Fit the weld with absolute precision. Pressure test the connection. Move on to the next machine. It was a rhythm built from necessity rather than choreography. Yet to an observer, it looked almost rehearsed. Pilots lingered nearby, drawn by a mix of skepticism, curiosity, and hope. One of them, Flight Lieutenant James Lacy, with more than 40 combat missions behind him, asked Schilling how something so small could solve something so dangerous. She explained the physics in simple terms. He nodded, understanding immediately. He had trained as an engineer before the war. He called it brilliant simplicity. Schilling inspected every weld. Her eyes moved over each joint with the focus of a surgeon. 3 restrictors failed her inspection that day. All 3 were pulled and replaced without complaint. The ground crews understood the stakes. A faulty weld at 15,000 feet did not mean an inconvenience. It meant a silent propeller against a backdrop of winter clouds. From Biggin Hill, Schilling's team moved to Hornchurch, then North Weald, and Tangmere. At every station, the same pattern emerged. Crews worked through their exhaustion. Pilots returned from patrols with a kind of quiet amazement. Dive attacks that once triggered panic now felt clean, controlled, almost natural. German fighters that once slipped away with ease found themselves under relentless pursuit. The tactical advantage of the Luftwaffe began to thin, not with a grand breakthrough, but with a brass washer no larger than a coin. One by one, squadrons adapted their tactics. With engines that no longer betrayed them, pilots could commit to aggressive dives, hold their line longer, and choose their moment of firing with confidence. Aerial engagements shifted. Instead of pulling out early to avoid the dreaded engine stall, Hurricane and Spitfire pilots pressed forward. They seized the initiative, forcing German fighters onto the defensive more frequently than before. Combat reports reflected the change with startling clarity. The British were no longer reacting. They were dictating. By mid-April, the effects rippled across fighter command. German after-action reports noted that British aircraft no longer lost power during negative gravity maneuvers. A problem that had defined nearly a year of combat had vanished almost overnight. The Luftwaffe could no longer lure their opponents into fatal dives. Their margin of superiority narrowed. And some commanders admitted privately that they could no longer rely on the same tactics. Production of the restrictor increased again. Rolls-Royce adjusted machining schedules to ensure that more than 1,000 units could be delivered each week. Installation teams expanded. More engineers joined the effort. Schilling continued to travel, her satchel always full of parts, her notes always in hand. She visited stations in rain, in fog, in biting cold. She stood beside aircraft under arc lamps in the middle of the night, while crews fitted restrictors onto fighters that had landed only minutes earlier from combat. The transformation reached beyond fighter command. Coastal Command requested restrictors for their long-range patrol aircraft. Bomber Command wanted them for their training units, where young pilots learned to handle the complexities of multi-engine machines. Even the Fleet Air Arm made inquiries for their carrier-based fighters, which faced their own challenges with sudden dive maneuvers over turbulent seas. Not every aircraft could be fitted immediately. Supply was still a challenge. Some units had to wait days. Others waited weeks. Yet wherever the restrictor appeared, the results were consistent. Engines ran smoother. Pilots trusted their machines again. The sense of dread that had hovered over every dive began to fade. By the end of the month, more than 2,000 Merlin engines carried the restrictor. The modification became standard equipment. Newly built Spitfires and Hurricanes left the factories with the washer already installed, a quiet testament to the power of a simple, elegant idea. The pressure carburetor remained under development, destined to eliminate the negative gravity problem entirely. But even Rolls-Royce engineers admitted that the brass washer had bought them precious time. Without it, far more British pilots would have died in those critical months. Through it all, Schilling kept working, inspecting, advising, adjusting. She did not celebrate. There was no time for celebration. War demanded constant vigilance and treated relief as a luxury. Yet everywhere she went, she saw the same signs. A pilot climbing from his cockpit with steady hands. A ground crew member wiping oil from a cowl with a confident grin. The unmistakable sound of a Merlin engine holding full power through a steep dive overhead. A rhythm restored. A wound beginning to mend. And a war, once tilted sharply toward the enemy, slowly beginning to balance itself again. Long before the numbers began to shift in favor of the Royal Air Force, the human cost of the carburetor problem had carved its mark into every corner of the fighter stations. It lived in the quiet moments between sorties, in the way pilots studied the sky as if looking for an omen, and in the way ground crews kept their tools close even during brief breaks. Ready to sprint toward an aircraft that returned with an unfamiliar sound in its engine, war demanded endurance. But the negative gravity failure demanded something crueler. It asked men to confront the possibility that their own machines could betray them, even when their instincts were perfect. For pilots, the days before the restrictor were filled with a particular kind of fear that rarely found its way into official reports. Many spoke of it only in the mess halls, after dark, when the weight of the day pressed harder on the shoulders. A dive should have been a maneuver of control, of precision, a moment when training took over and the aircraft became an extension of the pilot's will. Instead, it became a moment of doubt. Some described it as a hollow drop in their stomachs, the instant when the engine hesitated, the half-second of silence that felt infinitely longer than the altimeter would ever show. Others compared it to holding one's breath underwater, waiting to see if the world above would allow them to rise again. The restrictor changed that feeling, but the memory of it lingered. Flight Lieutenant James Lacy once told a ground crewman that he had never realized how much tension he carried in his hands until the first dive with the restrictor installed. He said the Merlin felt alive again, not temperamental or unpredictable, but steady, reliable. The transformation was not just mechanical. It reached into the lives of every man who flew those machines. The return of trust was as vital as the return of performance. For the ground crews, the human perspective was different, shaped by a responsibility that few outside the service truly understood. These men worked in shifts that stretched deep into the night, their fingers cracking from cold and oil, their backs aching from hours bent beneath open-engine cowlings. To them, every aircraft was not simply a machine, but a promise. If they missed a loose bolt or overlooked a hairline crack, the penalty was paid by someone else's son, someone else's brother, someone else's friend. When the restrictor arrived, many of them reacted not with excitement, but with quiet resolve. Another part to install, another point of failure to watch, another chance to protect the lives of the men who trusted them. Some ground crewmen later admitted that they had felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. Relief because the restrictor seemed to answer a threat they had fought against for months. Guilt because they worried they should have recognized the solution sooner. But Schilling never blamed them. She knew better than anyone that the failure had been baked into the design, not into the efforts of the men who worked tirelessly to keep the fighters alive. Her respect for the crews grew at every station she visited. She saw their hands tremble from exhaustion, saw the thick smudges of oil on their sleeves, saw the way their eyes brightened when a pilot returned safely from a mission that once would have been perilous. At the center of this human network was Schilling herself, a woman who had entered the war with the quiet determination of someone who understood engines not simply as machines, but as creatures with moods, limits, and personalities. She rarely spoke about the pressure she carried, but those who worked alongside her later described moments when she seemed to hold the weight of every pilot's life in her expression. She listened intently to any description of an engine noise, any hesitation felt in the throttle, any imperfection reported by a returning pilot. She wrote notes with the precision of someone who understood that no detail was too small. She often rode from one station to another on her motorcycle, chasing solutions along the winding roads of the English countryside, the wind carrying both her thoughts and her fears. Her life outside the hangars was no less defined by the war. She was married to George Naylor, an aerodynamicist turned bomber pilot. Each time his Lancaster took off, she faced a reality she understood more clearly, perhaps painfully clearly, than most spouses. Bomber command losses were staggering. 1 in 2 airmen never returned. She never asked George about his missions, and he never asked her about the projects that kept her awake long after the lamps dimmed in the laboratory. It was their unspoken pact, a way to protect each other from truths that neither could escape. She once told a colleague that she preferred to work late into the night during the weeks he flew, because the noise of engines on test stands kept her from imagining the silence that followed an aircraft that did not come home. Her colleagues at the Royal Aircraft establishment saw another side of her as well, a side shaped by the years she spent racing motorcycles. She still kept her Norton, polished and maintained with the same care she gave the Merlin engines. Now and then she would ride after leaving a station, pushing the machine through narrow country lanes, feeling the engine respond beneath her. The rhythm calmed her mind. Ideas that eluded her during laboratory sessions sometimes surfaced while she leaned through a curve or opened the throttle along a deserted stretch of road. She said little about these moments, but those who knew her understood that the motorcycle was more than a hobby. It was a companion that carried her through the mental demands of a war built on speed, pressure, and precision. Among the pilots, the human stories were just as complex. Some felt liberated after the restrictor transformed their aircraft. Others expressed anger that the solution had not come earlier. A few admitted that they had lost friends to the stall problem and could not help but wonder how many lives might have been saved if the brass washer had existed months before. But even those who struggled with those emotions acknowledged one truth. They owed their renewed confidence to the engineer who arrived at their stations with a small satchel and a quiet determination. One pilot, Flight Lieutenant Robert Stanford Tuck, known for his skill and daring, later reflected that the restrictor restored something he thought the war had stolen from him, the ability to trust the machine beneath him. He said that diving on an enemy fighter no longer felt like gambling with fate. It felt like a fair fight again. These were the victories that never appeared on maps or in communiques. Victories measured not in miles gained or positions held, but in relief breathed out on the tarmac, in a pilot's smile after a mission, in the steady hum of an engine during a maneuver that once carried the taste of fear. War is shaped by machines, but it is lived by people. And in the months after the restrictor appeared, the people of the Royal Air Force found their burdens a little lighter, their hope a little stronger, and their sky a little less cruel. To understand the broader significance of the restrictor, one must step beyond the airfields of southern England and consider how the wider Allied world viewed the struggle for control of the skies. By the spring of 1941, the war in Europe had become a test of endurance as much as firepower. For the United States, which had not yet entered the conflict but watched it closely, the performance of the Royal Air Force served as both a measure of British resilience and a warning about the demands of modern air warfare. American military observers who visited Britain during these months reported with great interest on the strengths and limitations of the Merlin engine. They understood that the air battles over the Channel were not isolated engagements. They were proving grounds for tactics, technologies, and engineering philosophies that would soon shape the aircraft industries of every major power. When news quietly spread that British fighters were no longer losing power during negative gravity maneuvers, analysts in Washington took note. It meant that the Royal Air Force had closed a gap the Germans had exploited relentlessly. It meant that future American designs would need to consider the same principle: stable fuel delivery under all flight conditions. The restrictor itself, simple as it was, resonated with American engineers who had long believed in practical, incremental solutions. It reinforced a truth that crossed national boundaries. A small change at the right moment can alter the momentum of a campaign. In American engineering schools and technical journals, the early reports from Britain were examined not as wartime curiosities, but as valuable lessons in adaptability. Later, when the United States entered the war and began producing aircraft at enormous scale, design teams drew upon the insights learned from the Merlin's vulnerability. They refined carburetors, improved fuel systems, and embraced principles that reduced the risk of engine hesitation during extreme maneuvers. Globally, The impact of the restrictor reached even further. In the Soviet Union, where British Spitfires later operated along the northern convoys to Murmansk, the modification ensured that aircraft delivered to the Red Air Force could survive the brutal conditions and chaotic dogfights over the Arctic coast. Soviet pilots and mechanics, unfamiliar at first with the Merlin's quirks, quickly came to appreciate the stability the restrictor provided. It allowed them to focus on the harsh realities of winter combat rather than the unpredictable behavior of a foreign engine. In Germany, the change did not go unnoticed. Intelligence analysts studying British combat performance noted a shift in tactics. British fighters no longer broke off pursuit during dives. They no longer hesitated before pressing an attack. German pilots who once relied on baiting their opponents into engine stalls found that the tactic no longer worked. The Luftwaffe, already stretched by losses and demanding operations, had to adapt quickly to a more aggressive adversary. For the Allied world, the restrictor offered a reminder that the war demanded not only courage and firepower, but ingenuity. It showed that a battlefield could be shaped by a washer no wider than a coin, crafted by an engineer with persistence and clarity of thought. In the global fight against tyranny, nations learned that every improvement, no matter how small, strengthened the chain that bound the Allied effort together. By the time spring turned towards summer in 1941, the numbers told a story that no commander could ignore. Before the restrictor, more than one-third of all diving attacks attempted by British fighters ended in engine hesitation or complete loss of power. Pilots broke off their runs. German aircraft escaped unharmed. And too many Hurricanes and Spitfires fell to the same predictable weakness. After the restrictor entered service, the failure rate dropped to a fraction of 1%. It was not merely an improvement. It was a transformation so dramatic that squadron leaders began to rethink the way their men entered combat. The kill-to-loss ratio shifted just as sharply. During the bleak weeks before the modification spread, Fighter Command struggled to stay afloat, losing nearly as many aircraft as it destroyed. Within a single month of widespread installation, the balance more than doubled in Britain's favor, then continued to rise. Pilots pressed their attacks with newfound confidence. They no longer feared the moment the nose dipped. They no longer wondered if the engine would betray them at the edge of a turning fight. With trust restored, their instincts sharpened, their reactions steadied, and their courage found solid footing again. Yet the restrictor's legacy cannot be measured only in percentages and ratios. Its true weight rests in the lives it preserved. Men who survived because their engines kept running went on to complete additional missions, train younger pilots, lead squadrons, and shape the Royal Air Force for years after the war. Some returned home to families who never knew how close they came to loss. Others carried memories of the restrictor quietly, understanding that a small washer hidden in the fuel line had stood between them and the silence of a dead engine over hostile country. The restrictor did not make headlines in the moment, but its effect radiated across decades. For Beatrice Schilling, the recognition came slowly and often reluctantly. She was honored with the Order of the British Empire in 1948. But even that distinction could not fully capture the magnitude of her wartime work. The Royal Aircraft establishment continued to rely on her expertise long after the battle skies had quieted. She contributed to cold weather starting systems for aircraft in Iceland and the Soviet Union, altitude compensation research for high-flying fighters, and refinements to superchargers that pushed the Merlin to new limits. Her mind never stopped searching, never stopped adjusting, never stopped listening to the language of engines. Still, when historians look back on her career, the restrictor stands alone. It was the rare achievement that combined elegant engineering, immediate implementation, and measurable, life-saving results. A solution born not from grand redesigns, but from careful attention to a flaw others had grown accustomed to tolerating. She saw what others overlooked. She acted when caution might have urged patience, and she accepted responsibility for the consequences. That blend of insight and resolve is why scholars of engineering point to her work as a model for future generations. After the war, she continued riding her motorcycle across the English countryside, chasing both speed and clarity. Colleagues recalled seeing her arrive at the laboratory with wind-tangled hair, and a spark of inspiration sparked from a morning ride. She and her husband, George Naylor, built a life framed by their dedication to flight and engineering, though neither spoke much about the shadows they carried from their wartime experiences. He had survived more than 30 bombing missions over Germany. She had spent years answering problems that meant the difference between life and death. They shared a quiet understanding, built not on words, but on endurance. When she retired in 1969, she left behind not a shelf of trophies or a parade of promotions, but a body of work woven directly into the safety and performance of countless aircraft. Engineers studied her restrictor, museums preserved it, students learned from it, and decades after her passing in 1990, her name returned to public memory in new ways. A pub renamed in her honor, a building dedicated to engineering students, a heritage society recognizing her as one of the extraordinary women of Hampshire. Small tributes, yet fitting for a woman whose greatest achievement had also been small, modest, and profoundly powerful. Today, one can stand in a museum and look at a restrictor displayed behind glass. It appears unremarkable, nothing more than a brass washer with a precisely drilled hole. Yet behind that simplicity lies a turning point in the air war over Britain. A whisper of metal that kept engines breathing when gravity turned against them. A reminder that sometimes history changes not through sweeping inventions, but through a single idea held firmly in the hands of someone who refuses to accept unnecessary loss. As we close this story, imagine once more the tarmac at Kenley. The low clouds, the smell of fuel, a young pilot climbing into his Hurricane with the weight of the war on his shoulders, and a woman standing a few steps away, holding a small piece of brass that might protect him when the world inverted beneath him. Her courage did not roar like an engine. It simply endured, precise and unwavering. If this chapter of history speaks to you, if it reminds you how ordinary people can shape extraordinary outcomes, I invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to WW2 Secret Archives for more stories rescued from the quiet corners of the past, where engineers, pilots, and forgotten heroes waited for someone to carry their voices forward. Their memories endure because we choose to keep them alive, and your presence here helps ensure they will never be lost.